Let me give you today's menu. So first I'll introduce myself. I'll talk a little bit about creative writing in the United States. Then I'll talk about creative writing pedagogy in the United States, move on to creative writing in Japan, talk about some of my own creative writing experience with some activities and examples. And then finally, if there's time, we'll do some Zoom room writing activities, which will mainly just be for fun. First, let me introduce myself, and perhaps it may seem quite vain to have a big picture of myself on the page, but this drawing of me was actually done by a student of mine who is now a longtime friend when I used to teach at Osaka University. And the drawing has a little bit of a point, which is that a lot of the time there's a conversation that is about how Japanese students aren't the most creative or imaginative or innovative. They just want to get the points or follow the rules, or they want to know exactly what to do. But I think that's very untrue. I think Japanese students are incredibly creative, and they just don't have perhaps the environment or the regular practice or the background from when they're young and at school to express their creativity. So my former student, Hiroki, very kindly drew this picture of me. So I like to use it as a portrait. It reminds me of his creativity, at least. Quick self-introduction. My background is in English literature, but American literature. I got both my BA and my MA in California at Sonoma State and at UC Berkeley. And my specialties are poetry in general and 19th and 20th century American literature, especially 19th century American Renaissance, Thoreau, Melville, people like that. I came to Japan in 2005. I taught at Osaka University basically for 12 years. There's a gap in that 2005-2018 spot. I had a part-time position at Kansei Gakuin, which is a major private university in the Kansai area, between 2015 and 2018. And normally I wouldn't put a part-time position down, but that part-time position was in fact teaching a creative writing class at the university. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I've been at the University of Nagano since 2018. My own creative writing background, I have written poetry since I was very young. I've published 2 books of poetry, which are ancient history now, published in 1999 and 2005. I've published some poetry since then, some creative nonfiction in journals like the Catamaran Literary Reader. Some of you probably know the Tokyo Poetry Journal. Most recently, my poetry has appeared in Cha, an online literary journal. And my family have been creative writing teachers. So my grandmother was the prose writer Bobby Louise Hawkins, and she was the head of the prose half of the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics at the Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado. And my grandfather was Robert Creeley, and he famously taught poetry in the University of Buffalo poetics program, and later at Brown University's Literary Arts MFA program. So I've got a lot of creative writing in my background. So I'd like to talk a little bit about creative writing programs in the United States. And the reason I'd like to give this background is because creative writing has not always been a part. It's a pretty new part of pedagogy in the Anglosphere. 2 famous events, origin events. One is the 1926 Bread Loaf Writers Conference, which is a writers conference that happens at Middlebury College in Vermont. Robert Frost was involved with that. And it's a writers' conference that still happens every year. I think it's usually at the end of the summer. And the idea was that writers could get together and write kind of before the academic year started again. And then 1936 is the founding of the Iowa Writers' Workshop at the University of Iowa. And this is probably the most famous writing program in the world. The amount of famous writers who have come out of the Iowa Writers' Workshop is enormous. And this really marks the time in American academic history when writers start working and teaching within the American Academy as kind of like regular faculty. It doesn't really start taking off until the 40s, and writing programs in American universities in general really start taking off in the 1960s and 1970s. So in the United States, there are now over 350 graduate level creative writing programs offering degrees like the MA, the MFA, the Master of Fine Arts, and also now the PhD. And usually the PhD in creative writing involves producing a creative work and then writing an extensive commentary that's related to that work, a kind of theoretical background. If you take undergraduate degree programs into account, there are over 720 undergraduate creative writing programs in the United States. It's a huge amount. They're very, very, very popular. Even as studying literature, like literary theory and criticism, has been declining in popularity, creative writing programs are still very, very popular. To give a sense of how grounded this historical movement was in the United States, it wasn't until 1965 that Canada established its first creative writing program at the University of British Columbia. And it wasn't until 1970 that the first creative writing MA was established in Britain at the University of East Anglia. So there's a spread of creative writing programs from this kind of center outward. Creative writing programs are not yet common in Asia. They're spread throughout the world, but they're not widely popular in Asia. Hong Kong appears to be a slight exception to this, with several universities offering creative writing programs and courses. At least one offers an MA, the University of Hong Kong. Hong Kong Baptist University offers an AA and a BA. How about Japan? I may be wrong. Somebody please tell me if I'm wrong. But as far as I can tell, there are no degree granting creative writing programs in English in Japan. There are a few creative writing programs that are for Japanese students. So for example, here's one. This is the Department of Creative Writing. And they actually don't use the word. Often it's katakanaized as creative writing. But here, it's the Bunge Hyogen Gakka. So that's the kanji they decide. And who's it for? It's for people who want to be poets, copywriters, people who want to write game scenarios, work on TV, write novels, write advertising. So it's creative, but also kind of a professional program. There's another one as well at Taisho University. And this one actually does use the creative writing course within a larger kind of department. And it seems to be similar to the other program. There are others, but those were the kind of the most significant I could find. So let's talk about the pedagogy of creative writing a little bit. So first, it's interesting to think about the fact that creative writing was not originally accepted as a kind of proper academic discipline. It was really looked down on in the academy and often dismissed, often especially by people who are studying literature as literary criticism and literary theory. And in fact, it's quite famous that at many universities in the United States, even to this day, I don't know if Princeton is still the case, but it used to be a famous example. The theory and criticism kind of literature department would be over here. And in another building all the way on another part of campus would be the creative writing department, right? So just kind of completely separate. So why do we have creative writing in the United States? Why does it appear as an academic discipline? Well, part of this history goes way back to the 1800s, maybe even the 1700s, if you start in Europe, and that is the importance of a progressive philosophy of education. And if we think about a progressive philosophy of education, you might think of people like Friedrich Froebel. If you don't know the name Friedrich Froebel, you certainly know the name kindergarten. Friedrich Froebel is the person who came up with the idea of kindergarten, learning through play, learning through creativity, that kind of thing. John Dewey is a major American philosopher who was also part of the progressive philosophy of education movement. And Dewey also very strongly advocated for creativity within the university rather than rote learning and that kind of thing. So starting in about, there are creative writing classes in the late 1800s at some universities, but really it's not until kind of like the 1920s that the progressive education influence gets people writing in the schools, students writing in the schools. And that's an emphasis on creativity and also learning through doing, which we now often call project-based learning, right? Other influences on, other reasons why creative writing happened in the United States. During the Cold War, there was a very strong ideological emphasis on individual creativity. And this was part of US government policy and propaganda to present the United States as a place of individual creativity and freedom against the kind of institutionalization, or at least the stereotype of institutionalized being that the Soviet Union presented at the time. And so the US government, in fact, promoted arts journals, literary journals. Some of them were secretly funded by the CIA. I mean, it's really interesting history, promoting creativity, creative writing, creativity in the arts, like abstract expressionism, for example. And these were promoted around the world as signs of America's unique, democratic, anti-communist aesthetic being. Kind of very interesting. Then in the 1960s, of course, you get like the hippie movement and the counterculture. And the 1960s also coincides with a strong renewal of progressive education in the United States. Ideas of self-expression, creativity, and we start getting the idea of using creative writing to find your voice, to express your true self, or even to find yourself or your identity. So this is a very kind of interesting kind of history, I think. And obviously very, very different than the Japanese educational tradition, and probably one of the reasons why creative writing as a discipline has made slow inroads in Japan. So some of the key creative writing ideas, creativity, craft, self-expression, self-exploration, and these kind of famous phrases in creative writing. Write what you know, right? Like talk about your experience, write about things that you've experienced. Show, don't tell. Use expressive, imaginative language to give your readers a picture or an image or an impression of something rather than just spelling it out for them. And of course, find your voice. Everyone is supposed to have their own unique and personal voice. And in the EFL, in the situation of EFL teaching, we can think of finding your own voice maybe in terms of L2 learners finding their own use of their L2 language, quite different than an L1 use of a creative voice, but still interesting to think about. Okay, so how is creative writing generally taught in the US? Now, because I came up through this kind of thing, this is very obvious to me, but maybe it's not obvious to everyone. Maybe this is new information, I'm not sure. But it's almost always in the form of a small workshop, 5 students, 10 students, sometimes maybe 20 students, and a teacher who is a writer. And students will often take that workshop based on what they know about a writer's work, or perhaps about what kind of things the writer is teaching. Maybe the writer's teaching a genre workshop, or maybe the writer's teaching a workshop about developing style or something like that. In the workshops, what generally happens is that students generally read kind of model writings, works of fiction, creative works, works of poetry. They talk about them. They kind of talk about how they work, how do they create their effects, what is the author doing, what tools are is the author using. And then they'll, of course, write their own pieces. And those pieces are generally, the verb is workshopped. They'll usually read a piece out loud, share it with other students, and then other students will talk about what they think is good or bad, what works and doesn't work about that particular piece. And usually the professor will as well, the writer teacher. Goals of creative writing programs are interesting. Probably the main goal is to prepare students for professional life as a creative writer. So not only developing their own writing style and what they want to write about, but also learning about publishing, forming networks with other writers, learning about how to win prizes in contests. But another thing that creative writing programs do is prepare students for professional life as creative writing instructors. Once students have published a couple of novels, published some essays, they can get a job teaching creative writing at one of the institutes of creative writing. I know about 5 or 6 people who have these kind of jobs, and then they teach other younger creative writers the craft, and then they go on to become writers. Most professional writers who are writing creatively, as opposed to genre fiction like fantasy, say, or working in journalism or writing for magazines, don't make enough money to make a living just by their writing. So generally, they take a job teaching in a creative writing program. The other goals are, of course, just in general, to develop a high level of writing skill. People use that in all kinds of careers, but also to just, for yourself, increase your own expressive ability and ability to be creative and express yourself. Many students value that in itself without expecting to become successful professional authors. So, what about creative writing in Japan? Well, in English, creative writing courses or classes are taught at several universities in Japan. Almost always as elective courses, often as courses that happen outside of the regular academic term, maybe during a summer session or winter session, special intensive course, that kind of thing. And I have 4 names here. 2 of them are pretty famous in Japan. Suzanne Kamada, who teaches at Tokushima University. She's written probably a dozen fiction books by this point. She's a really great author. She's widely published, and she teaches creative writing there. Ian Maloney, I haven't read any of his fiction, but he's one of his most famous books in Japan is called The Only Gaijin in the Village. Came out a few years ago about his experiences living in the countryside. He used to teach at Nagoya University of Foreign Studies, where he developed a lot of his creative writing practice. And now he teaches at Sugiyama Jogakuen University. And then Luke Draper and Christina Tatt, I'll just talk about some of the interesting things that they do in their classroom. And all of these people are members of the LILT SIG, the Literature and Language Teaching SIG in JALT. And why is that? Well, as Ian Maloney says, creative writing in Japan is niche. And I found this quote in an interview with him that I quite like. A year or so ago, someone contacted me via email about a paper they were working on, looking at how creative writing was taught in Japan. She asked me a few questions, then said, "Can you put me in touch with other creative writing teachers?" Then I listed a few people she had already contacted. That list comprised everyone I've ever heard of who teaches creative writing at university in Japan. It's still very niche. Many people seem to think it's a waste of time or that it's very low on the list of priorities. Now, I'm biased, but I'd say that creative writing has so many benefits for second language acquisition across the board that it is odd not to use it. And that's from an interview in 2021, so very, very recent. So what are some of the things that people point to as positives of using creative writing in the EFL classroom? I've got a list of references at the end, but kind of across the board, people tend to talk about the same thing: an increase in student engagement, an increase in students' confidence in their English ability in general, and writing in particular, also self-expression, an increase in the enjoyment of writing, and some people talk about an increase in the enjoyment of reading. Obviously, there's an emphasis on fluency writing. So if you want your students to be able to write more, faster, more smoothly, creative writing can be helpful there. And students also may be able to help find their voice as an L2 speaker, their L2 speaking identity. So here are 2 quotes that I'd like to read. One is from a book about creative writing programs in the United States by Mark McGurl, called The Program Era. And this is a history of the creative writing programs in the United States and kind of readings of the literature of various writers who have come out of them. And he writes, in creative writing, more than any other subject, it can seem that the teacher is grading a person, not a paper or answers on an exam. It is, after all, a therapeutic educational enterprise in a way that, say, a physics class could only inadvertently be. No wonder then if, as poet teacher Anna Leahy has observed, self-esteem is a hidden guiding principle in our pedagogy. So within the creative writing workshop, developing self-esteem, a writer's sense of themselves, a writer's confidence to express themselves, those are all part of L1 creative writing practices and philosophy. And then this is from Ian Maloney, a paper he's written called The Impact of Creative Writing on L2 Writer Confidence. It's in the references at the end. I think I have a link to it as well. You can find it online. It's a really good paper. It's fresh. It's 2022. Here he's talking about an academic, Yang Zhao. So Yang Zhao has been a pioneer in the field, and her that is L2 creative writing, and her contributions to it cannot be underestimated. Her 2015 book, Second Language Creative Writers, Identities and Writing Processes, is an important milestone in the exploration of this subject. Taking as already established the benefits creative writing has for second language acquisition, taking as already established the benefits creative writing has for second language acquisition, she moves focus to creative writing's utility in promoting self-identification and hence self-esteem, which in turns feeds into positive motivation for language learning. So yeah, sounds pretty good to me. Okay, so what about some creative writing and English teaching techniques? Well, I'll talk about my own in a bit, but I wanted to introduce the techniques of some other people who teach creative writing in Japan. So Suzanne Kamada has a couple of interesting writing activities she assigns. One is the ABC poem or story, and this is where each line in the poem or the story begins with a new letter of the alphabet, starting from A and going to Z. It's a challenge, fun, a little bit like a game. Some creative writing activities are like that. Students get a lot of enjoyment out of it. So they're working with the writing while they're getting great pleasure out of playing the game of language. Another is to rewrite a story from another point of view. And this is it's become kind of a popular genre in a lot of ways. John Gardner, who is a famous writer, was writing in one of the creative writing programs in the US. I forget which one, maybe Syracuse. In the 70s, he wrote a book called Grendel, which is the legend of Beowulf told from the point of view of Grendel the monster. And there have been lots and lots of books like that. Anyways, in this activity, you tell the story from another point of view. And one example of that from one of her students is the story of Momotaro, but told from the viewpoint of the Oni, the demon. Another type of story activity is to mash two different stories together, aspects of two different stories, and make something new. My own example here is Ted Lasso, the comedy about the American soccer coach coaching a football team in Britain, meeting Friday the 13th, meeting Jason. What would happen in such a crazy story? So students can have fun with these kind of stories. Other important parts of her class's writing practice, publishing the stories together in a journal at the end of the course. All students get the journal. They can read each other's work. They can feel like they've been a part of an event. A peer review, like the workshops I was talking about, reading each other's work and commenting on it. In her own discussion of peer review, she talks about making sure that students are prepared for peer review, that they're ready to be kind and nice and enthusiastic, not kind of critical and mean, because that's not the point of these activities. And also a focus on creativity rather than accuracy in grammar and spelling. And that's, I think, one of the main points that most teachers of creative writing in the EFL context talk about, is getting students away from worrying about accuracy in grammar and spelling and getting the language to flow. And I think we can all appreciate that in terms of trying to get discussion to happen in the classroom, and trying to get students to stop trying to translate in their heads when they make a sentence. Ian Maloney, in some ways, in his classes, has a more traditional sense of what to teach. Like these are all these kinds of activities. What I mean by that, I guess, is that these kinds of writing activities are all writing activities that you might find in a creative writing class in the United States. And this is his own quote here, but he teaches travel writing. And one reason he chose travel writing is because pretty much all students have had some experience of travel, even within the country. And most students have a desire to travel, or many students do. And these particular students were all, I think, getting ready to go on study abroad programs. So travel was something they were thinking about. He did a poetry unit, teaching specific forms, haiku, acrostics, concrete, and they would produce a portfolio of poems at the end of the unit. Each student had their own set, probably sharing with each other. For Unit 3 script writing, they focused on radio drama, which is easy. So, I mean, interesting. Why radio drama? Well, of course, because you can't, you have no visuals to help you with the meaning of the language. So that means that all the meaning has to be conveyed through the language. And finally, short fiction at the end. Luke Draper and Christina Tott both teach at Kansei Gakuin, and which seems very amenable to having creative writing taught at that university. Luke Draper has an interesting idea, which is that reading L1 texts and trying to use them as a base for creative writing may be very difficult for L2 students, because a lot of L1 literature deals with difficult or complex cultural meaning. And so, so students may have a hard time interpreting that literature, and that may put extra cognitive load on them when they try to do their own creative writing. So in his classes, what he did was he gave students a translated L1 story, story translated from Japanese into English, in one case a Haruki Murakami story. So the students could read the Haruki Murakami story in English, and then the story ends at a particular point. And so then they continue the story, is this assignment, continuing the story after something ends, making a part 2. And so presumably students would be familiar with the cultural background of the story. Very interestingly, Christina Tott, she's been teaching an extensive reading course at Kansei Gakuin, and Kansei Gakuin has a big extensive reading program. It's become incorporated into their EAP, their English for Academic Purposes program. And what she wondered is, what if we add extensive writing, creative writing, to an extensive reading course? And Suzanne Kamada has joined us. She's added creative writing to an extensive reading course, which is really interesting. This is just from her own writing. The writing component of the course consisted of weekly writing assignments, which culminated in a short story as the final project of the semester. A minimum set of requirements for the final project was introduced in week 6. The final narrative had to include examples of the writing techniques taught in class, and at least one exchange in the form of dialogue. Also, 2 main characters had to be developed. So, a story with these kind of requirements. I don't know how many of you are familiar with X reading. X-Reading, probably most people by now, but X-Reading is an online extensive reading platform, which you do have to pay for, and which we do use at the University of Nagano to teach extensive reading. And one interesting thing about X-Reading is that recently X-Reading has started to incorporate works by student writers. Last year at, I think it was the main JALT conference, I think I saw a paper about this by a professor who is having his class do extensive reading and write these stories as part of this class, write books for extensive reading. And I wish I could remember his name, but I can't, so I'm sorry. But you can see here, there's a whole section, student writers. And let's take a quick look at a little bit of writing by a student writer. This is A New Love by Konatsu Tomita. And you can see that there are some main characters in this book. There's Max. I'm going to say Quayla, Beggy, Dorothy, Kiki, Haru, and Windy. And you can see that Quayla turns into Kiki, Beggy turns into Haru, and Kiki has assassination power, Haru has hallucination power, and Windy has wind power, which is pretty fantastic. And here's just an example of the prose. Oh, look, there is Max over there, shouted Becky. Whoa, 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 what? Surprised Quayla. Max is a transfer student from NY. He is handsome and kind. Quayla fell in love with him because he is a good person. I hope he doesn't see me, said Quayla. Oh, hi, Quayla, said Max. Hi, said Quayla. He greeted me, whispered Quayla. Yeah, but that's a normal thing, said Peggy. I know. So I quite like that. That's quite entertaining. Okay, so let me talk about some of my own examples of using creative writing in the classroom. And these are a little bit of ancient history. And I would definitely have done a lot of things differently now if I had the same kind of online tools that I had back at this time. But I'll just give a couple of examples, and they're very different teaching situations. So the first is teaching at Osaka University. And all students, as elsewhere in Japan, take 2 years of classes. They have 2 English classes in a semester that meet once a week for 90 minutes. Originally, when I worked there, there was no leveling in the classes at all. None. So I'd have a student who was a returnee from the US who'd lived there for 5-6 years, practically a native speaker, and a student who could not say 2 sentences in a row in the same class. Very difficult teaching situation. Later, students were divided, but basically just into 2 groups, regular students and the upper level, the high octane students. Classes are organized by major, often with mixed majors in a class, which could also make things a little bit difficult. Students had to take one of 4 classes, but they could choose which one to take. There was a listening class, a reading class, a speaking class, and you guessed it, a writing class. And most students chose the speaking classes because they assumed they were the easiest and most fun, or they chose the reading classes because they didn't have to do anything but passively read, or the listening classes. And the least amount of students chose the writing classes because they thought, oh, that's going to be hard work. So there was generally some level of motivation among students who chose to take the writing class. There is no curriculum that builds on it at Osaka U when I was teaching there. It seems to have changed a bit now. You had no idea what other teachers were doing in the classes. You had no idea what knowledge students were coming into your class with. So a very difficult teaching situation. Also, there was no English major at Osaka University until 2007 when they merged with Osaka Gaidai. And even then, the English major was basically at another campus than the main campus. So not a lot of English-oriented students. I tried to teach the writing class with a textbook for one semester, and I did not enjoy it. I then tried to make my own writing class and have students write kind of like essays and stuff like that. And I did not enjoy that either, and neither did the students. Their essay writing was very dull, labored. They weren't really interested in their topics. They were just kind of choosing them to choose a topic and fulfill an assignment. So I decided I wanted to bring some creative writing elements into the class. So I started to have students write a journal, make news articles, an encyclopedia entry, do fluency writing at the beginning of class, and group short stories, mainly for fun. The news article and the encyclopedia entry, formally, students learn the form of a news article: headline, opening paragraph, how to write paragraphs. I'm teaching various kinds of things about how to make more complex and sophisticated sentences, punctuation use, that kind of thing. But all of the information in the article and in the encyclopedia entry comes from the students themselves. They invent everything, and they can be as crazy as they want to be. So first, let me talk about the journal. For the journal, I really encourage students to be super creative. I told them this is a place to be free, to be creative. I think it's only worth 10% of the grade, so not a lot of pressure on the students. I would have students photocopy their entries and give them to me so that I could kind of take a look at them. I told students I couldn't correct everything, but I'd correct some things, especially if I saw repeated mistakes. I'd make comments. I'd engage with the students that way. I'd make some suggestions about not how they could improve, but how they could have more fun or be more creative with their journal entries. I always told students to keep their original journal entries because I wanted to see them all at the end of the quarter, because I handed them back the photocopies. But always at least one student would have decided that as soon as class was over, before the last class, journal was gomi, and they'd throw it in the garbage, and then they'd be like, "Sensei, I don't have my journal." And I'd be like, "I told you every class to keep your journal and give it to me at the end." But anyways, so these are the examples that I showed the students about what they could do in terms of making their journals. I wanted them to write by hand. I gave them this little bit from Linda Berry, which shows how your handwriting itself can be expressive. I don't know if you know the artist Tadanori Yoko, but he's kept a very a notebook for a long time, a journal kind of thing, and he does a lot of collaging. I showed students some artists' notebooks that are kind of journals with pictures. The picture on the lower left is very famously Lewis Carroll's story of the Dormouse from Alice in Wonderland. So it's not a journal, but it's showed how you can be creative visually that way. And even this bit with the whales on it is a whaling journal from the mid-1800s, I think. And I just showed them where even something that's completely practical can be made creative. And some students really made just amazing journals. They really got into it. Other students, more kind of standard daily journals. The news article. So first, we'd look at a newspaper article. Students would become familiar with the parts. And I put students into pairs, and they'd make a story. They'd write an original news story in the style of a news article. And students would often write about campus-related topics. So off on the right, this little statue here was added when I was working at Osaka University. It's called Machikani Doji. It's kind of a little strange, became a topic for students in news stories. Often this statue would come to life at night, or spies would hide a computer chip in the statue that would be important for some kind of, worldwide event or that kind of thing. I made students quote eyewitness testimony, so they learned how to use quotes. That was very interesting. Students had a lot of fun. UFOs would be involved, time machines would be involved, all kinds of crazy stuff. Then I made students write an encyclopedia entry. And I started with having them just write a short paragraph about something they created. And it could be really anything. Imaginary animal, plant, historical event, famous person, place, imaginary city, product, anything's fine. And we used simple Wikipedia. And actually, I think I even made a condensed version. But if you've never used simple Wikipedia, it's Wikipedia, but in much simpler language than regular Wikipedia, so good for language learners, and it's much shorter. So I'd kind of give them that as an example of what kind of information they should put in. Oops, I didn't mean to stop sharing entirely. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. And then they'd write their one paragraph description. They'd share it with other students. Students would talk about what other information they wanted to know. I'd give some suggestions, give some advice. And the final step would be a full-blown encyclopedia entry, 2 to 4 pages long, double-spaced, 12-point font, with an introductory paragraph, supporting paragraphs, giving more details. And they were required to use the writing techniques that had been taught during the semester. So some of the sophisticated sentence structures we'd learned, proper use of punctuation. I taught them the semicolon and the colon, so they had to use at least one of each of those. And then they had to make academic sources. So they had to quote some experts, and then they had to have a reference or a bibliography at the end. And just literally a fake book title, fake dates, all that kind of stuff. But through that, they learned what the form of a bibliography should look like. Fluency warm-ups were just kind of like easy, 10 minutes of writing in class. I didn't collect it. Prompts were very simple. Sometimes I'd have the students read them to each other if it was a fun prompt. And there was some group writing. I'd just give students a sentence to start with, and then they'd go around and they'd write together. And one student would write one line, pass it around to the next student. They'd write one line and keep it going like that. Each student started at their own page. So if in a group of 4, there would be 4 different pieces of writing going on. So no students sitting there kind of twiddling their thumbs while 3 other people are writing. At the end, they choose the story that they like the most, hand that in. I write some comments about grammar and that kind of thing, and then give them back to the students. The students fix it. And I'll read you a couple of examples really quick. This is mostly just for fun, but they can write some short stories this way. A young man was walking to school as usual. Suddenly, he was spoken to by a very beautiful woman. She was really beautiful, so he immediately fell in love. He wondered if he should say, "I love you," but just then the woman said, "I am looking for my husband." "Well," he said, "I'm sorry, but I'm busy. I'll go now." However, that same evening, the woman came to his house. She said, "Please tell me the truth. I think my husband is here in your house." "I am your husband, and you are my wife. You have lost your memory. Please come in and let's live together again," he said calmly. Oh, what a story. So I've got a couple more examples like that, but we're short on time. So let me tell you a little bit about creative writing at Kansai Gakuin. This is very, very different. This was for graduate students in the Graduate School of Language Communication and Culture. And I have this very long quote here because this is their description of their program. As far as I can tell, their program does everything. You can learn how to be a Japanese teacher. You can learn how to be an English teacher. You can study English language literature. There's regional cultural studies program, interdisciplinary multilingual and multicultural studies program, drama studies program. I mean, just like all these programs. So my students were great and interesting graduate students, but they were all doing completely different things. And they were all had completely different interests in taking a creative writing class. Something you'll find in the EFL literature a lot is that when students take a creative writing class, they are generally taking a creative writing class because they're interested in improving their English in some ways, improving their writing skill, boning up on their English, improving their fluency, but they're not so interested in the creative part per se. In all that time, I think I had about 30 students over the course of 3 years, maybe less than that, probably 20 students. In all that time, I had one student who took the class because he wanted to try creative writing in English. And that student was also already a creative writer in Japanese. Okay, so for this class, I assigned students a journal, pretty much just like the other class, and asked them to be as creative as possible, and really great journals. And students wrote a lot. Sometimes students would write 2 or even 3 pages by hand, which is great. I also would give them supplementary short creative assignments that they would write in the same space as their journal. And then they had 3 essays, a descriptive essay, a motivated essay, a personal essay, and various poetry activities. So I didn't have them writing any fiction. Why not? Well, I was trying to think, what do students, and maybe especially graduate students, need? And a lot of Japanese students who write in English have trouble with deep description. English really likes to describe things in detail. And a lot of L2 students, and maybe this is general and not only Japan, but a lot of L2 students can be kind of really general in their writing. So I really wanted to emphasize writing about things in detail, the physical environment, but also the mental environment, emotions, feelings, thoughts, and also the world of sensation, what people are tasting, hearing, seeing. These are things that are very important in creative writing in English. Just got like 3 minutes left. So I will hurtle through this now. Journal's the same, as I said. Supplementary writing assignments might be things like, I just give them a writing prompt. And these are some classic kind of creative writing prompts, like write from the point of view of an everyday object. I had one student who wrote from the point of view of a tea bottle. They wrote about being made, being filled, their head being violently twisted off while their insides were drunk by a human. Interesting stuff. Write a zoological description of humans in public as if they were animals, as if you were a zoo watching animals. That was a fun one. Describe a memory using your 5 senses. So the things that you smelled and tasted in that memory. Using a metaphor to describe your morning commute to school. I would hand out photographs in class, and students would tell a story about it. Or an alien lands in Umeda. Describe your experience of that. We had a lot of reading for the class, very sophisticated reading. This would be like a creative writing program in the States where you would read materials, comment on what the authors are doing. Most of the students were able to read this material. I did have some students who had lower levels of English, and they got by. They said it was hard, but that they enjoyed it. And then I had them do 3 essays. For the first one, describing an object in as much detail as possible, but also the personal thoughts and feelings inspired by the object, anything about interesting facts about the object that could be added. That was the first assignment. The second essay was the most difficult for students, I think. I would ask students to try to write an essay that was attempting to convince the audience of something, but not by using logical argument, but instead by using kind of emotional descriptions, storytelling, some of the literary techniques we'd seen. And I said it couldn't be something serious, like about global warming or the horrors of war, or it can be personal, humorous, silly. I had one student write a great essay basically about her struggles as being very, very, very slightly overweight in a world that values slimness, and just how much she loved food. And so it was just this kind of great essay about where she had this angel and devil on her shoulders, basically, telling her to eat, telling her not to eat, adopting the point of view of society, her mother telling her to lose weight, just all this kind of great stuff. It was really, really, really good. And then the final assignment was long, 5 to 10 pages long, a kind of personal essay in which students describe an event or memory, explain its significance, and use some of the techniques that we talked about in class. And I am going over, so I won't talk about the poetry. There's some examples. I'll put this in the chat. You can read it later. I did have some student feedback from that class, and I have left the spelling mistakes in it because, again, spelling is not necessarily the point. I think I improved how to write sophisticated way and also how to pay attention to my grammar, even though I am not perfect yet. However, I think my mistakes were less and less every time I wrote essays. So thank you very much for letting me improve my English writing skills. I also started to have interest to read novels, short stories, and poems again. I brought out my old Whitman's paperback to read on my way to school. So thank you very much to give us a chance to change during creative writing class. So this student talks about rediscovering a joy of reading and also changing through the class, which is something you'll hear a lot in, read a lot in the EFL literature. I'm going to stop sharing now. I have references at the end of the PowerPoint, contact information, some online creative writing resources that you can click on, which I stole from somebody else. Credit is given. And I will put in chat right now both a PDF and a PowerPoint of the PowerPoint that I've just given, in case people would like that.